Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'm going to be discussing Rishi Sunak's much lambasted budget statement from another angle, really. Keeps coming up. This time it's considering that far from being the terrible strategic error that it appears to be, may actually be the inevitable approach given the Conservatives' political needs right now. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So I was inspired to do this video based on a couple of tweets about the budget and Conservative strategy that I saw. But before I get into that, I want to discuss the budget statement, which, as I've already discussed several times recently, doesn't actually help any significant section of society against the background of how I see the Conservatives and their attitude to governing, because it might be tempting to suppose they're making a massive mistake. It's certainly arguable that Rishi Sunak has made a massive mistake, but have the Conservatives? No, not necessarily. They might still lose the next election. That may be on. The next election is very likely to be some way away. Because they'll have been in power for 14, maybe 15 years by then, and people will naturally be getting weary and wanting a change. Labour may also improve their campaigning strategy. We'll have to wait and see on that one. I still have grave doubts in that direction. But strategically, the Conservatives do not appear to be making a mistake with this budget. It is sad to think that we have a political system whereby a government can deliberately ignore the needs of the majority in favour of a really small group of people. But that is the reality. And I'm not saying that any system would compel a government to act in people's best interests. But first past the post is especially problematic. It really comes down to this. The Conservatives are the party of the billionaire. Now, it doesn't matter whether you think that this was not always the case or not. It's absolutely the case now. We have seen recently really clear examples of how the government are favouring foreign billionaires, particularly over the interests of their own citizens. This is not a case of favouring bosses over workers, as it used to be framed when I was growing up, but foreign oligarchs over British citizens. You know, they have bent over backwards to protect most of the wealthy billionaires linked to Putin's regime, for example, but it's not just Russian oligarchs that they're in bed with. And they've ignored, for example, the sacking of 800 British ferry workers, until it became public, that is, so that the royal family of the UAE could become a little bit richer. In fact, if you look at their policies, none of them are designed to help a single demographic of British voter. Like, you look at the budget statement, you think, well, which small section of society does this help? It's like, none of them. So the Conservative Party right now isn't aligned with any significant section of the British population. And this is what is leading people to say this is a mistake. However, although our democracy is in sore need of modernising, it does remain a democracy. Like, they do need to persuade millions of people to vote for them in order to remain in power, in order to further enrich the foreign interests which funds them. In order to do this, they have to identify, so which groups of people do we need to persuade come election time? And this is a natural consequence of any form of democracy. It is as true in any form of democracy. You know, you focus your efforts on those voters who will meet two criteria. The first, they must be interested in potentially voting for you. No point chasing after votes that will never be yours. No point at all. That includes people who are too ideologically opposed to your party, but also those who just don't really vote for anyone. There are significant sections of the population in this country who do not turn out to vote. No point in wasting a lot of resources trying to attract their vote. Unless, of course, you can persuade them to turn up and vote, but that doesn't generally work out well. The second criteria is that those votes must be able to tip the balance. No point chasing votes in areas where you are either certain to win or cannot possibly win. There are some seats where you could get a swing of 5,000 votes and you would still lose very badly. There are other seats where you could get a swing of like 500 and that would win you the seat. So although both the Labour and the Conservative Party will be wanting something like 15 million votes, their election strategy has to focus on the swing voters in the marginal constituencies that will determine the outcome. That boils down to a few 100,000 votes. It might be like 250,000 out of the 14 or 15 million votes that they need. That is the difference between power and opposition. Remember that Boris Johnson only won about 300,000 more votes than Theresa May. Theresa May lost her party's majority. She had to form a minority government. Boris Johnson won the biggest Tory majority in Parliament for decades. And this is where we come to these comments on Twitter recently. So someone has expressed surprise that the government have pushed an extra 1.3 million Britons into absolute poverty with their economic policies, including an extra 500,000 children, which is on top of the millions already in poverty. We already have over 4 million children in this country in poverty. That's children, not just people. We are one of the richest countries in the world. It is mind-blowing how we can allow this. But then a journalist points out that the Tories are calculating that their best interests lie in attracting the votes of the lower middle class and the elderly, not the very poor or the young. Now, what's the reason for this? Well, let's take the last groups first. The government are not addressing the interests of the very poor or the young because they do not vote in significant numbers. Really, voting numbers for these groups is so low that it can never be part of any party's intelligent strategy to target them. Complete waste of time. Obviously, a good government will address their needs. You don't ignore them in government. But in a campaign, utterly pointless in trying to win their votes because their votes are not up for grabs. And remember, there is a difference between how a political party acts in a campaign and how they act in government. The previous Labour leadership failed to appreciate this distinction. And so it was constantly trying to attract votes that just were not there, and failed to try and attract votes that were there that were needed to win a general election. They were constantly trying to appeal to people who did not vote. But the current Conservative leadership are also failing to see the distinction, but in reverse. Boris Johnson is always in campaign mode. He's never settled into a cycle of governing. This is why the main purpose of his government seems to be provoking culture wars. He's constantly trying to rally his support base. A sensible government will focus on target voters during the election and in opposition. Then, once they've won power, they will govern in the common interest, as they see it, within their political ideology. And then as the next election approaches, they swing back into focusing on the voters and the campaign made. But the Conservatives right now have never entered the government phase. If you think about the legislation they're passing, it's all legislation designed to remove democratic controls, norms, institutions. It's all about stealing the next election with a really small minority of votes. You can't really point to any policies and go, that's what they're doing in order to try and reform Britain, even within a right-wing ideology. You can't really point at anything like that because none of it does that. This is why it should come as no surprise that the latest budget statement doesn't help any group at all, much less all of those in need. The other reason why the Conservatives in particular can ignore the very poor and the young at all times, even outside election campaigns, is because for the small numbers of these groups who do vote, they really, really don't vote Conservative. So the Conservative Party in particular is not going to bother with anything for them. Remember what I said, the Conservatives are the party of the billionaires and the foreign shareholders. Those are the people their policies are designed to help. Any help they give to ordinary British citizens is purely transactional. It is the bare minimum needed to buy their votes, and they will haggle for them. And just as with any transaction, you don't want to spend over the odds. They want to do it as cheaply as possible. They want to spend as little as possible on helping any groups of voters, that they target as being a good source of votes, because they want to maximise the funds available to resource their real interests, the super wealthy. And the super wealthy have very high maintenance costs. Their interests will never be the very poor or the young. So what about the groups they are targeting? Well, we'll take the elderly first because they're also pretty common for the Tories' cousins in America, the modern Republican Party. How is it cost efficient to target the elderly for their votes? Well, first of all, the elderly do vote in large numbers. So using tactics designed to address the common interests of the elderly is a very efficient way to farm votes. Even persuading a small percentage of them can yield a disproportionately high number of votes. So then how do they target the elderly? Well, they offer up above inflation increases to the pension. Like, if you look at income rises over the course of the last 12 years of Tory government, for pensions, it's actually been a lot more than inflation. It's actually not as big a rise as under the same number of years as Labour government. Labour still increase your pension by more, but the Conservatives do increase the pension. Labour also gives them is better at controlling prices as well, so that the pension goes further. The Conservatives don't do that part, but the Conservatives do understand that they need to take pensions seriously as part of their con. It's also safe to impose tax rises on the poor without hitting the elderly. Take the increase in national insurance, for example. It's going to hit the young, whom they don't care about, but it's not going to hit much of the elderly. And although the government have reduced fuel duty on fuel by 5p a litre, they also don't care that actually the overall cost has still gone up by 40p in the last year, because most elderly people aren't going to be hit hard by it. A large increase in petrol prices mostly hits transport businesses and those who have to drive a significant distance to work. If you're elderly, if you're retired, you may drive, but you don't drive very often. And some journeys you may just go, oh, the price is a bit high, I just won't make that journey today. Much less likely to impact the elderly. It's also less likely to impact the lower middle classes that Tom McTague talks about as well. So the government don't feel the need to do more than offer some token help. The Conservatives will invent enemies from whom the Conservatives will protect them. This is relatively straightforward because serious parties don't waste their time with policies to act against mythical dangers. That being said, a real fear that the Conservatives like to stoke, that of crime, is a potential stumbling block for them now. They have been in power a long time, so it's increasingly difficult to not only claim that crime is really high and you need to vote Conservative to stop it, but also that it's somehow the fault of the party who've been out of power for, 14, 15 years by the time of the next election. But in general, they do push their law and order hard on this group. When it comes to the other group, the lower middle classes, it's entirely about the culture wars. This is a group of people who have been screwed over by Tory policies, but the Tories will tell them it's the unemployed or it's the foreign workers. They tell them that Labour, with their proven track record of higher incomes and lower taxes for this demographic, is somehow part of the metropolitan elite and won't help you at all. They also tell them that they understand their problems. When their privately educated arses don't even know how to buy a can of cola and a tank of petrol. But it works because they have the media on their side, feeding them a constant drip of these lies until it is seen as the truth. Two demographics who do vote in significant enough numbers to make a difference and whose votes can be attracted without having to spend very much of the money that is otherwise earmarked for billionaires and to make them more billionaire-y. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.